The following video is part 3 of my 3-part series covering the chronology and history of Sonic the Hedgehog. If you missed parts 1 and 2 in the last weeks, I'd say watch them first. If you did miss them, I'll briefly say that in the first video I covered the history of the Sonic series from the early to mid 90s, and then in part 2 we spent an incredibly long time on the evolving storyline of the series from the late 90s all the way to the 2000s, leaving off with Sonic Rivals 2 and the PSP. Now we can get into the final video where we go over everything from the late 2000s all the way up to today. There's a lot of things that will be discussed in this one, so you best strap in. But first, I have to mention the fact that this video was brought to you by Omaze. I'm excited to be working with Omaze to offer you the chance to win an all-electric Hummer EV Edition 1 while supporting a great cause. Rebuilding Together, a non-profit that does the necessary repairs needed to help their neighbors stay in their homes following disasters. Go to omaze.com/jaysreviews to enter for your chance to win. Omaze is a brand that set out to help non-profits in a new way, giving people the chance to win once-in-a-lifetime prizes while all the proceeds from the donations support non-profits, meaning they can spend less time and money raising funds and instead focusing on helping their communities. As of this recording, they've raised over $150 million for charity and only plan to go up from there. So if you're a car enthusiast, or someone who wants an all-electric Hummer EV Edition 1, you'd best be moseying on over to omaze.com/jaysreviews and enter now. All donations support Rebuilding Together, like I said. With that established, let us return to the show. Sonic Unleashed. I said this one was a lot different than previous games, which can be seen with its gameplay, as the game debuted the boosting mechanic into the 3D series, which redefined how Sonic levels were made going forward, like SA1 had done when it was released. While it does still have many tropes that came from the adventure games in its story, Sonic Unleashed also laid the groundwork for the games that would come after this and how it tells that story. You may have noticed that in a large chunk of the games discussed in Part 2, the series started to focus less on Sonic himself despite being the title character. Sonic Heroes' most important campaign is Team Dark's, Sonic Battle's all about Emerald, Shadow gets his own game. The game titled Sonic the Hedgehog is about Shadow, Silver, and Elise. Sonic doesn't even know what's going on in the Rivals games, and the list goes on. Not to say Sonic was not important in any of those games, you still play as him for most of them, I just mean to say that Unleashed was a bit of a refresh, as the prior games kept going and going with more lore and characters being put on top of each other. Unleashed having almost nothing to do with the plots established in previous games, being more self-contained, which is how a lot of the games in this video are. You begin in outer space with Dr. Eggman's armada that Sonic tears through in spectacular fashion, even becoming Super Sonic in the opening of the game. Still to this day the most visually impressive and engaging Sonic cutscene. This was a setup as Eggman uses his new machine to draw the Chaos Emeralds from Sonic and use their energy to blast the Earth with a giant space laser, but one set to specifically shatter the planet into several different pieces to awaken the monster that lives inside the core called Dark Gaia. Sonic, taking the brunt of the machine's energy, has Dark Gaia's powers infused with him, transforming him into Sonic the Werehog, a vicious, combat-oriented version of Sonic that Eggman flings out the airlock alongside the energy-drained Chaos Emeralds. Although, Sonic doesn't have to stay like that forever, since he only becomes the Werehog at night. Even though he doesn't feel or act differently in this form, he just can't run fast and can instead go combo mad. Anyway, Dark Gaia is too weak to hold form at this point, so Eggman has to find a way to bring it back to use its power to rule the world. Meanwhile, Sonic crash lands on Earth and meets a flying rabbit-looking thing that has no memory of anything, not even its name, that Sonic calls Chip. The two of them join forces with Tails to go on a globe-trotting adventure exploring various countries on Earth, interacting with the people who live there as you gradually bring the planet back together by locating the Gaia temples hidden on each continent that restores the power of the Chaos Emeralds in the process. Sonic Unleashed resonates with a lot of fans specifically because of how it's simple but grand at the same time. Just exploring these Sonicified versions of the different cultures on Earth is charming as Sonic and Chip grow in their friendship throughout the story, cringe-inducing English line reads from Chip notwithstanding. The plot itself isn't that complicated, which I think helps it remain focused on good moments like Amy finding Sonic in Werehog form, but she thinks it's another one of those times where she's confused Sonic for someone else and leaves, which makes Sonic feel bad about his current state. The game also provides countless memorable action scenes throughout that keep the story feeling like a fun adventure rather than melodramatic. By the end of the plot, things become clearer as Chip learns at the 6th Gaia Temple that he's actually Light Gaia, whose purpose is to defeat Dark Gaia whenever he rises up, which has occurred in an endless cycle for millions of years. But this is the first time Chip was ever able to see the world he protected and is grateful for that fact. Eggman tried awakening Dark Gaia prematurely, and because of that, Light Gaia also awoke, but unclear on his purpose because of Eggman's forcing this to happen. But it doesn't matter now as you get to the coolest climax in the Sonic franchise. While you've been restoring the shattered planet, Eggman has built his final fortress on the last continent yet to be restored, building it around the last Gaia temple that goes directly to the core of the Earth where Dark Gaia resides. Ever since Sonic Adventure 1, the Doctor has been discussing his plans for Robotnik Land and later Eggman Land as his ultimate goal. Unleashed finally decided to pay that off by having him succeed in creating it. The ultimate monument to himself. Eggman statues and symbols everywhere. It's a carnival from hell, and this is the final level. They don't skip a beat here since it's one of the hardest Sonic levels to ever exist. Roller coaster rides that go off the tracks and onto a path of lasers, conveyor belts of doom, surprise blindsides, no drop shadows. Wait, what? It's memorable to say the absolute least. As if the final level wasn't chaotic enough, the final bosses are even more so. Sonic as the Werehog first battling the Egg Dragoon mech that sends you plummeting into the core of the earth as you use the Werehog's strength to pull the machine apart piece by piece. Even though the emeralds are all back to normal, Dark Gaia is fully powered up as Light Gaia uses his powers to call upon all of the temples to form a battle suit as Sonic transforms into Super Sonic to land the final blow. Dark Gaia also draws his power back from the Werehog form before this, so Sonic loses out in that transformation. The finale of Unleashed does just about everything you'd want in one of these games, although mechanically the last boss is a slog to play, going on for far too long and being very repetitive. But the moment was quite cool as Super Sonic blasts right through Dark Gaia to finish it off. The planet is saved from Dark Gaia's corruption and the final continent begins to go back in place. Light Gaia, knowing he's fulfilled his duties, sends Sonic back to the surface ready to go back to hibernation until Dark Gaia comes around once more. Sonic still has Chip's ring though, and he can use that to remember him by, setting off for the next adventure, ending Sonic Unleashed. One of my favorite Sonic games despite its pacing problems. It's just a memorable game, and a challenging one. A big win for its replay value. For the timeline, I'm placing it right after Rivals 2, not just because it came after, but because of what I said at the top of the segment. Unleashed was the beginning of a new direction for Sonic, so it's only natural to place it here. Although technically, what order the Rivals games, Secret Rings, and Unleashed go in really could be any mixture of the four, just as long as Rivals 2 is after 1, obviously, and that it's after the Rush games. But that's what happens when things become more self-contained, I suppose. Moving right along, the next game dropped just a few months after Unleashed, Sonic and the Black Knight on the Wii from 2009, this being the sequel to Secret Rings. This time, Sonic is pulled into the world of King Arthur by a wizard called Merlina. Merlina is being hunted by King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Lancelot, who's portrayed as Shadow, Gawain, who's Knuckles, and Percival, who's Blaze. Merlina claims that King Arthur is immortal and holds on to power with the scabbard of Excalibur, so Sonic needs to defeat him to end his rule. Sonic pulls the sword, Caliburn, from the stone and uses it to become a knight himself. The story is about Sonic and Caliburn, who can talk, as Sonic actually gains the skills to defeat the Knights of the Round Table and then King Arthur. This game has some of the coolest moments for Sonic, as his cockiness feels right at home for this kind of adventure as he slashes through enemies and obstacles, while still taking the time to be a proper hero by helping people in need, not just fighting bad guys. But in the final twist, King Arthur was nothing more than an illusion, and Merlina wanted the scabbard of Excalibur to become super powerful herself. This is because she's grown to be nihilistic, seeing that all things come to an end, now wanting to have the power to keep the kingdom going forever. Sonic and the other knights team up to stop her plans as the sacred swords combine to turn Sonic into Excalibur Sonic, who defeats the Dark Queen form of Merlina. In the ending, Sonic shows compassion for her, understanding why she might do this, but knowing it's natural for things to change just the same.
Merlina, every world has its end. I know that's kinda sad, but that's why we gotta live life to the fullest in the time we have. At least, that's what I figure.
Sonic's actions deeming him worthy of being the true King Arthur. No, I'm not kidding, that's a thing that happens. But Sonic eventually returns to his own world and gets his story enshrined in the book, Sonic and the Black Knight. Like Secret Rings, the plot of this one is perfect for Sonic Team to get more out there and creative with Sonic, and I'm all in favor of it. The timeline in this one is funny because there's little to work with, given just how isolated the plot here is. However, there's just one detail to latch onto. In the post-credits scene, Sonic is criticized by Amy for using this phony King Arthur story to excuse his having forgotten about their date. In Sonic Unleashed, it's possible to accept a date from Amy that will happen after the world is saved from Dark Gaia. And there you have it, the game takes place after Sonic Unleashed because of that alone. So now we reach the 2010s. I already dismissed Sonic Freeriders earlier, so we can just talk about Sonic the Hedgehog 4 Episode 1, which released in 2010, and Episode 2, which came out in 2012. Despite the name Sonic 4, I'm tossing these games out of the stratosphere as far as canon is concerned. Externally, Sonic 4 was meant to be a mobile game that Sega upcharged as a console game and called it Sonic 4 to cash in. But then they called it Episode 1 to make up for its disgraceful lack of content. It's a total sham of a game. Episode 2 improved things, but it was too little too late for this whole thing. But then internally, it's a mess. Episode 1 kind of breaks my rule that games with no story are things I can't work into a timeline, as the plot is just Eggman is bad, stop him. It is a story, but it's so insignificant because it's a mobile game. which is fine for that platform, but not for the sequel to Sonic 3 and Knuckles, one of the most epic 2D platformers of its day. It also vaguely takes place between Sonic 3 and Sonic Adventure, muddling the waters with the 4 years of spin-off games that happened between them that I talked about in Part 1. Then you have Episode 2, which has more going for it technically, but is still a mess conceptually. It takes place immediately after Episode 1, with Tails returning for this game. But then the game also tries cross-promoting the Sonic CD remaster from 2011 by bringing back Little Planet from that game, as Eggman retrieves Metal Sonic from Stardust Speedway and grows him back to full power in order to fight Sonic again. This could explain why Metal Sonic was created before Mecha Sonic but then not used again for several games. He simply got left behind on Little Planet, although it shows Stardust Speedway bad future because they ripped the assets from Sonic Generations, which, if taken literally, means that Little Planet couldn't have left because if you don't destroy all the robot generators in CD or don't collect the Time Stones, the Doctor uses the Time Stones himself to bring Little Planet back. Oops. But then, you have the Death Egg Mark II being created around Little Planet, which, regardless of what ending you get in Episode 2, is still that way by the end of the game. And since Episode 3 was deconfirmed before Episode 2 even released, it leaves the plot of Sonic 4 off on a cliffhanger that will never be resolved. So, rip Little Planet, I guess. For all these reasons combined, I am chucking Sonic 4 where it belongs, straight out of canon. I decided to devote all this time to it now because it's a game literally called Sonic 4, so one would think it's important enough to include, but I am not, and those were my reasons. So let's continue with actually important games. Sonic Unleashed was like the Adventure 1 of the 2010s, a game preceding the new decade that laid down a lot of the foundation for later entries while still being similar to previous ones, like I said. In that comparison, Sonic Colors is definitely the Adventure 2 equivalent, as this game was released on the Wii in 2010. You still had the boost gameplay from Sonic Unleashed, but now with reduced scope in terms of story, which was a breath of fresh air at the time of Colors' release. I mean, how many times in Part 2 did I say Sonic then turns into Super Sonic to defeat the monster? It's not something I have a problem with, but Colors, like I said, was a breath of fresh air. This game takes a more comedic approach in terms of writing, which also stuck with the games that followed this one, introducing a new voice cast for all the major characters besides Eggman, and changing the lore a bit once again. In Japan, Sonic's world has always been called Earth ever since Sonic 1. Once the games went 3D and the Japanese lore just became the main Sonic canon worldwide, it was still called Earth. Starting with Sonic Colors, it became a little more ambiguous.
And Sonic's world will be the center of my interplanetary theme park.
Whatever Sonic's world is. 2010 was clearly meant to be a clean slate for this series. The incredibly positive reception to Sonic Colors cemented that direction. So this time around, Dr. Eggman, apparently feeling remorseful for his past transgressions, has built a giant interstellar amusement park that Sonic and Tails have snuck into, as Sonic believes something must be afoot. He is correct because Eggman has attached several planets to the main hub of the park and transformed them into theme park rides. Eggman's true goal was to get Planet Wisp, a far-off planet that's home to the Wisps, a race of aliens possessing incredible power called Hyper-Goons, which the Doctor wants to use to power his planet-wide mind control beam. For that reason, he's rounding up Wisps en masse and using them to power all his machines as Sonic sets out to rescue them, being able to use their power to perform new abilities, as each type of Wisp can pull off different feats, like the Cyan Laser Wisp that Sonic can use to fly forward and ricochet off of walls, or the Orange Rocket Wisp that can blast into the sky. Sonic and Tails specifically befriend a white wisp called Yacker, needing Tails' Miles Electric tablet to translate his and the other wisps' alien language. By the end, Eggman is converting the wisps into these negative wisps called Purple Frenzy Wisps, or Purple Void Wisps, but we'll get into that in a second. As Sonic puts a stop to it all in a battle against the Doctor's final mech, the Egg Nega Wisp armor, as the station is destroyed in a giant explosion. But the trapped planets are set free and the Wisps can return home, thankful to Sonic for everything he's done, even saving him from the explosion as he couldn't outrun it on his own. Another simple story concluded. However, it's the canonicity of Sonic Colors where things get interesting. Sonic Colors, like many games before it, had two versions. The main series game is, without question, Sonic Team's version on the Wii. However, Dimps, the developer of the Sonic Advance and Sonic Rush games, had developed a DS version of Sonic Colors that launched alongside the game Sonic Team did. While it may seem like an easy thing to ignore, like I had done for Sonic 1 in the Game Gear, I don't think we should write off Sonic Colors in the DS quite like that because it's not the same story but presented worse, like, say, Generations on 3DS or Unleashed on Wii. The DS version of Sonic Colors is the exact same plot but without the focus on humor, instead being more to the point. Which isn't really an argument in its favor or against it in terms of canon. But then you have the fact that Sonic Colors DS fleshes out the theme park by populating the attractions with Sonic characters, something that didn't happen on the Wii, which made the whole thing feel pretty empty. These characters lead to non-essential moments, but ones that make it feel like you're still in the Sonic world. For example, Eggman's new lackeys, Orbot and Cubot, are tasked with capturing Wisps, but they accidentally go after Cheese the Chow and you help Cream by stopping them. Colors on DS being the first time Silver and Blaze interact in Timeline B, as the two acknowledge that they work well together, and perhaps they once did. Things like that which serve to add more meat onto the bones of Colors. But that's not all. DS Colors has exclusive wisps, like the red Burst Wisp or the purple Void Wisp, and while you could say that these differences are to be tossed out because it's the secondary version of Colors, the Burst Wisp would later appear in Sonic Forces as one of the Avatar's Wisp-On abilities. And as if that wasn't good enough evidence that there was something here, this'll do it. While Sonic Colors and the Wii did not have a supersonic battle or involve the Chaos Emeralds in the story whatsoever, the DS game is a different story. You can collect the emeralds in the special stages, and then, after the Nega Wisp armor is defeated, you unlock the true final boss of Colors DS with a Mother Wisp, a figure not included nor mentioned at all in the Wii game, is corrupted with negative Wisp energy herself as Supersonic defeats this form of the Mother Wisp, returning her to normal. Which brings the story to a close. The Mother Wisp returns in the background of Team Sonic Racing, which is canon, and we'll talk about it later. But then that begs the question, am I outright saying that the DS version of Colors is canon? Well, when I first conceived of this video, I did go in thinking I was going to say that because of this evidence, but then one thing got in my way. This moment from Sonic Lost World.
I've been looking for you, Baldy McNosehair!
This calls back to the translator not functioning right in Sonic Colors.
Who they call Baldy Nosehair.
Baldy Nosehair! That's the best thing I've heard all day! I gotta remember that one.
I searched the script of Colors on DS, but this interaction never happened, but clearly is canon in Lost World and Frontiers. So where does that leave us? Well, I've reached a new conclusion. Rather than simply stating that one version of Colors is canon over another, instead I'm going to do what I had done with the 90s games and headcanon it to fill in the holes. Since both versions feature the same exact main plot, we could simply say that what Colors DS added, like the Burst Wisp, the extra character cutscenes, and the Mother Wisp all happened, we just didn't see them in the Wii game. It was off-screen. Just imagine a fully 3D version of these cutscenes and this boss fight and you're good. Having said all that, we can safely play Sonic Colors after Sonic and the Black Knight with no issues. But then you get Sonic Generations, the Sonic game that, after deliberating on it, I realized is my favorite Sonic game of all time. This was the 20th anniversary celebration as you ran through 9 of the best stages from Sonic's history as not just modern Sonic but also classic Sonic. The original designs of Sonic fused together to represent the series in the 90s. Modern Sonic playing like Sonic Unleashed and Sonic Colors, and classic Sonic levels were inspired by the games on the Genesis. It's just a fun game with minimal padding or poor content. It's a straightforward, good time. One that is light on story, though. Eggman was trapped in outer space following the ending of Sonic Colors until he stumbled upon a force unlike anything he'd ever seen. The Time Meter, which Eggman uses to enlist the help of his younger self, and the two use the Time Meter to destroy all of Sonic's past victories, which first begins with classic Sonic who's running through Green Hill Zone and is caught in the effects of the Time Meter. Fast forward to the present, and Sonic is celebrating his birthday with his friends as the Time Meter blasts through history, warping Sonic to a timeless void where he has to play through these old levels and fight old bosses to rescue his friends with the help of his younger self, gathering the emeralds along the way, ending with Super Modern Sonic and Super Classic Sonic destroying the Time Meter, putting an end to the latest Eggman scheme, as the two doctors get trapped in white space themselves. No idea how they got out of that one. As the game ends back at the birthday party with Classic Sonic and Classic Tails given a portal back to their time, ending Sonic Generations. In terms of the game's actual story, that is genuinely it. I said it was light on plot after all. This is even less material than Colors. The plot of the game feels undercooked as the rest of the cast do nothing but appear in these tiny cutscenes after each stage. This game was definitely more about the gameplay than most of the games up to that point. With the story stating it takes place right after Sonic Colors, we will place this game, from modern Sonic's perspective, right after Colors. But where this matter gets more intriguing is in relation to how it goes from classic Sonic's perspective. Classic Sonic's appearance in Generations was meant to be a one-off, however he became a recurring character in 2 of the later games. So the implications of Generations on the games I discussed in part 1 is worth going into. Here's what we know. This is a version of Sonic who knows Tails, meaning that from the perspective of our timeline, Sonic 1, Sonic CD, and the 8-bit Sonic 2 have all taken place. However, Dr. Robotnik does not know Knuckles, nor does he recognize the modern look that Amy has. So therefore, I'm going to say that this Sonic has yet to experience Sonic 3. But on that note, Sonic 2 goes right into Sonic 3. So I'm going to say that Generations for classic Sonic takes place between Sonic Chaos and Sonic 2 on the Genesis. Why that specifically? Well, Sonic 1, 2 on Game Gear, and Sonic Chaos all take place on South Island, and classic Sonic was pulled into this story from Green Hill Zone, located on South Island. So we could then say that this is the moment he gets roped into the story. Now that would mean classic Sonic had never faced the Death Egg robot before and had not gone Super Sonic yet, and yeah, that works for me. But the discussion doesn't stop there though. This creates a split in the timeline as a result of classic Sonic's traveling to the future, one where Generations takes place and then goes to Sonic 2. This is what I'm going to call the Neo-Classic timeline, a world where classic Sonic's adventures play out largely like we saw them in the main timeline, but they don't lead to Sonic Adventure. Things go slightly differently. I would say the second most confusing part of Sonic's history behind the Eggman-Nega situation in the Rush and Rivals games is the world of classic Sonic. When classic Sonic returned in Sonic Mania and Sonic Forces, we were told this was the same classic Sonic from Sonic Generations, only now he isn't from Sonic's past, he comes from another dimension that is classic Sonic themed. So while the classic adventures were still canon to the main timeline I've been discussing, there is a separate world where SA1 doesn't happen and we get more classic Sonic stuff. It's in this case where I feel like official statements help, but can be freely tossed out if it allows the timeline to make more sense. Like I said in part 1, the people who officially run Sonic can just have whatever games they want made, and then the people whose job it is to promote Sonic explain it in a way that makes sense at that moment in time. Then it's up to us to make sense of it. But it could all be changed later. Generations said outright that it was a time travel story, Forces playing it to where classic Sonic was always from another world. Recently, it was stated that now it's been changed to where there is no classic Sonic world at all, and that Mania and Forces from the perspective of classic Sonic are just part of the past in the main timeline. This directly contradicts what's in those games, so how do I make sense of it personally? Well, I'm taking a little bit of everything in order to keep the timeline making sense. I don't think Sonic Mania is canon to modern Sonic's timeline for reasons I'll discuss when we get to that game in a few moments. So I'm going in with the explanation that Generations creates a split timeline for classic Sonic that runs alongside the main timeline we've been discussing. Another world from a certain point of view. After Generations, Sonic 2 is next in the timeline, then Sonic 3 and Knuckles and Triple Trouble. But now we can add games from the 90s back into the lore that I left behind in part 1, starting with Knuckles' ChaosX and the 32X. This game is one I tossed out in the main timeline because it debuted the ChaosX, but Sonic Heroes rebooted them completely and later games stuck with the Heroes ChaosX. But in a timeline where things aren't leading to SA1, you don't have to worry about it. Set a few months after 3K and Triple Trouble, Knuckles teams up with SBO, Charmy, Vector, and Mighty the Armadillo to stop the Doctor and Metal Sonic from using the Chaos Rings on a new island that has come up from the sea. Sonic and Tails must have been on vacation this month or something. This is one of the more obscure Sonic games released on the 32X, an add-on for the Genesis that sold supremely poorly, and the game has never been re-released, not even once. I think it's because the game is terrible. I can't think of one reason it would never be included in a compilation besides that. It looks like the classic Sonic games, but it's just so boring to play with its 25 samey stages where you wander around looking for the goalpost, not doing any platforming or going fast or anything. It's no good, this one. So from this point, you then have the games I discussed in part 1, Tails Sky Patrol, and Sonic Labyrinth. We can take advantage of this time that Sonic and Tails are on separate adventures to toss in another game I left out in part 1. Sega Sonic the Hedgehog, an arcade game from 1993 where you used a trackball to control Sonic through deadly traps as he's been captured by Robotnik alongside two new characters, Mighty the Armadillo, who later appeared in Knuckles' ChaosX, and with them is Ray the Flying Squirrel. I've never played this game as it was arcade only, but I'm mentioning it here because Mighty and Ray are exclusive to the Neo-Classic Sonic timeline, as stated by Iizuka himself back in 2017 when Mania was a few months away from release. Which will become relevant later, I promise. Sega Sonic doesn't have much going on, I just needed to bring it up to establish that Mighty and Ray exist. Another arcade game I skipped over before was Sonic the Fighters, released in 1996, built off the engine of Sega's other game, Virtual Fighter, and it certainly looks it. Not in a derogatory way, I'm just saying that this game looks like some mid-90s 3D and I find it pretty charming. This one I have played, first being re-released in the Sonic Gems collection on the GameCube, but then getting its own PS3 and Xbox 360 port in 2012. Not sure why this game of all things got that, but it's pretty fun in a simplistic way as you fight against other Sonic characters in a tournament with these really cartoony sound effects and animations. The reason being that Robotnik has launched a new Death Egg, and Tails' rocket has only one seat, so the characters decide the only natural course of action is to fight against each other to see who will board the shuttle. Each character granting the victor, your chosen character, a Chaos Emerald as you end the game with a battle against Metal Sonic and Dr. Robotnik. This game debuted new characters, Bean the Dynamite, a duck who's proficient in explosives, and Bark the Polar Bear, easily the most difficult character to beat in the game. Bang also returns from Triple Trouble, one of his few appearances outside of that game. SBO is included, so this game can only be included in a world where ChaosX is canon, so here we are. The only odd thing with this game is that there are 8 Chaos Emeralds in it, but the game is structured in a way where you have to fight every character in a set order. When you reach the spot where you'd fight the character you're playing as, you have to fight a clone of that character made by Robotnik. This is how you get the 8th Emerald. So I say we can just pretend that doesn't happen and proceed like normal, placing this game after Sega Sonic and before the last couple classic Sonic games, Sonic 3D Blast, Sonic Blast, and Sonic R, which we went over in part 1. finally leading to the first new game in the Neo-Classic timeline, Sonic Mania. This time, Robotnik has found a magical rock buried on Angel Island called the Phantom Ruby, which has the ability to alter reality, used in the game to turn these egg robos into a group called the Hard-Boiled Heavies, as Sonic, Tails, and Knuckles fight against them. The Phantom Ruby warping reality to where the trio must run through areas from South Island, West Side Island, Little Planet, and Angel Island like Green Hill Zone, Chemical Plant Zone, Stardust Speedway, and Hydro City Zone, and more, alongside new areas. While this game doesn't have much plot, instead focusing on being a perfect throwback to the old games in a gameplay sense, its many references to the history of classic Sonic are the linchpin in the whole Neo-Classic timeline. For example, in Mirage Saloon, you battle against the Heavy Magician who can create illusions. In the boss fight, she uses this power to look like Fang, Bean, and Bark, confirming that Sonic the Fighters is a game to include in this new timeline. Then, in Stardust Speedway, you race against Metal Sonic, but he transforms into Metal Sonic Kai at the end of it. This was the final boss of Knuckles' ChaosX, so that game is also one I added for that reason. At the end of the game, Dr. Robotnik gets into a battle with the Heavy King over the Phantom Ruby as Sonic becomes Supersonic to fend them both off. But this causes a reaction where the Phantom Ruby opens up a portal that pulls Sonic inside of it. A cliffhanger for the good ending of Sonic Mania that was meant to lead into the game that was coming out in a couple months' time from then, Sonic Forces, where classic Sonic was set to appear once more. However, to discuss Sonic Forces, we have to go back to the main timeline and work our way there with modern Sonic, who we last left off at Sonic Generations. The very next game was Sonic Lost World on the Wii U in 2013. Never liked this one back when it came out, always thought it was a boring Mario clone with Sonic elements in it and had a pretty conflicted story that tried to do too much in too small a time. But hey, that does mean this segment will be short. Sonic and Tails are seen chasing after Eggman, who's once again assisted by Orbot and Cubot. Eggman is back to his roots of collecting animals by putting them in badniks, but this chase leads to the Lost Hex, a floating collection of hexagons that all have different environments: grasslands, deserts, beaches, forests, volcanoes, and flying desert. The Lost Hex is home to the Zeti, or the Deadly Six: Zavok, Zaz, Xena, Zor, Zomom, and Zik. These folks are under the command of Eggman via the magic conch shell, until Sonic punts it into the stratosphere, as the Deadly Six then turn on Eggman and plan on using his machines to completely drain the world of all its resources and energy, destroying all life on Earth, causing Sonic and Tails to team up with Eggman to put a stop to it. Along the way, Tails is captured by the Six, and they try turning him into a robot, but he reprograms the machine while they aren't looking to make that not happen, and once the Zeti are defeated, Eggman fights Sonic and loses, the world is saved, Sonic and Tails go home, and Sonic takes a nap, ending Sonic Lost World. Lost World is another one of those very self-contained stories, however we know it's after Sonic Colors because of the joke I mentioned earlier, but would also be after Generations because Colors leads into that game. The Deadly Six never really caught on as a team. In my opinion, it was because the game doesn't do much with them outside of being boss characters with a single sentence or even single word personality. However, Zavok himself will become a recurring character in the games going forward, so that's something that has come from Sonic Lost World, a game that goes right after Generations in the timeline, leading to Sonic Forces. We did just skip from 2013 to 2017, and that's because in between we had the Sonic Boom brand that also never took off, despite the 3 years of time dedicated to it. But on PS4, Xbox One, and Switch, Sonic Team was back with Sonic Forces, and this time was going to be a return to the bigger stories from the games of old. Eggman has found the perfect way to take over the world this time, the Phantom Ruby, which he finds on his doorstep one day. This being the version of the Phantom Ruby from the main timeline. In the classic timeline, it was used by Robotnik in Mania. Eggman fuses it with a mercenary called Infinite the Jackal, and with their combined strength, they're going to take over the world, overpowering and capturing Sonic as Infinite uses the Phantom Ruby not only to become powerful himself, but creates illusions of Shadow, Metal Sonic, Zavok, and Chaos that Sonic has to contend with. Infinite was once a regular mercenary hired by Eggman, but got beat by Shadow the Hedgehog so badly that he was desperate for more power, which was revealed in the DLC chapter called Episode Shadow. 6 months after Sonic's defeat, the rest of the cast, Knuckles, Amy, Tails, Rouge, Silver, and the Chaotix, work to fight against the Eggman Empire, which has taken over 99% of the world, as a new recruit joins their ranks following his survival from one of Infinite's attacks. This is your custom character. He can look and appear however you want, and I shall refer to him as the Avatar. The Avatar is tasked with rescuing Sonic from the Death Egg, which brings Sonic back into the fight. Meanwhile, Tails gets attacked by Chaos, but at that moment, a Phantom Ruby portal opens up as classic Sonic comes through to save the day. You play as modern Sonic, classic Sonic, and the Avatar to take back the world from Eggman. Sounds cool and all, but this game's main issue is that the plot is very rushed. Cutscenes feeling too short to give the plot much time to breathe, and despite the shorter running time and more focused premise, some things still don't make sense, like in the games that had more complicated stories, such as Shadow just showing up to reveal that the Phantom Ruby projects physical illusions. It's never explained how he went from beating up Infinite a few months ago to then hearing of Infinite's plan right before the game to going AWOL for 6 months. But either way, at this moment the heroes stand no chance against the Phantom Ruby until they find a way to nullify its power. But by that point, the Doctor has activated his final scheme of creating a virtual sun to kill everyone as the heroes lead an assault on Eggman's Imperial Tower. But they shut down that sun thing in the nick of time, and Sonic fights Infinite alongside the Avatar. They couldn't beat him alone, but together they could, the one thing Infinite lacked. As Infinite is then absorbed into the Phantom Ruby, I think, Eggman's final mech is fully powered by the Phantom Ruby as the Sonics along with the Avatar destroy it, saving the world as classic Sonic is returned to where he belongs, while the rest of the cast can look towards fixing the damage done by the Eggman Empire, the Avatar taking off to parts unknown once all is said and done. With it being the next game, and because Zavok is used as a Phantom Ruby illusion, we can safely slot this game right after Sonic Lost World and then right after Sonic Mania and Classic Sonic's timeline. And while we're there, we should wrap that up. Following Forces, we got several things related to Sonic Mania, including YouTube shorts called Sonic Mania Adventures and a physical edition of the game called Sonic Mania Plus. The first episode of Mania Adventures shows classic Sonic's return from Forces, however Sonic Mania Plus included a new mode called Encore Mode which also shows classic Sonic's return from Forces, where he then teams up with Mighty and Ray, who are back in the games now, alongside Tails and Knuckles to travel through altered versions of the stages to once again stop the Phantom Ruby from being misused. If you remember the rules I outlined at the very beginning, this video concerns games only, so therefore Mania Encore Mode takes precedent, going after Forces in the Neo-Classic timeline, which is the last we're going to hear of that timeline for the rest of the video. So now we can just focus on the main timeline with Modern Sonic for the final two games. First up, Team Sonic Racing. This is a game I've never played. I didn't like Lost World when it came out, I hated the boom stuff, and thought Forces was pretty lame as well. So therefore I decided to not pick up Team Sonic Racing since I didn't think it looked very good either. However, it included a story mode where the heroes are in a car racing competition run by a Tanuki called Dodon Pa, who may seem suspicious but is actually above board, and Eggman is the villain again. The cast is divided into teams of 3 like usual in this series. I bring it up because Zavok is seen on Eggman's team, and this is the real Zavok, unlike Forces. The games never really say what happened to the other Deadly Six members, and more importantly, that Zavok no longer has a vendetta against Eggman like he did in Sonic Lost World. But despite that, the plot of this one was confirmed canon, first in the Encyclopedia as one of its racetracks has wreckage from the war and Forces, and then it's mentioned in Sonic Frontiers. So that means we can put this game right between Sonic Forces and finally, Sonic Frontiers. Since this game just came out, I'll again issue a spoiler warning. Skip to this timestamp to get past it. The opening cutscene of Frontiers shows Eggman on the Starfall Islands interacting with some cyberspace technology that traps him inside of it as he relies on his cyber program turned life form called Sage. By watching the Frontiers prologue animation on YouTube, you can then see that Knuckles found some ruins on Angel Island that were also part of this same system that brought him head-to-head with the technology of the Ancients and Sage herself, as Knuckles also gets trapped in cyberspace. The Chaos Emeralds were drawn to the Starfall Islands as Sonic, Tails, and Amy set out to explore them, which results in them being sent to cyberspace, where Sonic escapes and is told by a voice in the sky that he can rescue his friends by collecting the Chaos Emeralds and becoming Super Sonic to defeat the Titans that guard every island. Sonic Frontiers is the first game in a while to feel like it's part of an ongoing series. I mean, this is the first Sonic Team game in a long time where they try to make past events relevant to the characters in the present. The first game in a while to use the Chaos Emeralds and Super Sonic as important parts of the story. The first game in a very long time that tries delivering lore that further fleshes out our understanding of the Sonic universe. Throughout the game we learn about the Ancients from tens of thousands of years ago, descending from another planet that used the power of the Chaos Emeralds to battle against a malevolent force called the End, fleeing their home and arriving on Earth, drawn to the power of the Master Emerald, which is apparently a separate entity from the Chaos Emeralds entirely. But the End had followed the Ancients to Earth, and the Titans they created couldn't stop the End, so they sealed it in cyberspace, which they created. The player can unlock these memos that Eggman recorded while he was in cyberspace, and it's here where we learn that Riders is evidently canon and all the other tidbits that I went over in part 2. But he also talks about how the Ancients were the distant ancestors of Chaos. The Ancients migrated to Angel Island and due to radiation, devolved into the Chao, and as established, Chaos was a mutated Chao himself. Now, the Ancients bringing the Emeralds to Earth from another planet tens of thousands of years ago works in theory until you remember that Unleashed claimed that Dark and Light Gaia fought for millions of years with the temples and the Emeralds. But if you just headcanon the Ancients to predate that, then you're good. The Ancients left behind on the Starfall Islands have their spirits represented by the Cocos that you help during the game, putting their spirits at ease. While in cyberspace, Eggman is protected from all the threats by Sage, who he starts to feel a father-like affection for, realizing he created intelligent life. Although by that metric I feel like he'd be pretty proud of Metal Sonic, but that's neither here nor there. As in the end, the voice guiding Sonic actually was the End, who did help Sonic free his friends, but the catch was that the End is freed from cyberspace as Super Sonic and Sage team up to destroy the thing. And while I thought the final boss was kind of a mess, all these energy beams going all over the screen, the moment was pretty cool as you get I'm Here, then the new vocal themes playing in the background. This game has plenty of cool vocal themes, but this one took the cake for me. But in the end, Sage sacrificing herself, saddening Eggman to the point where he's seen in the post-credits scene finding a way to bring her back online, while the heroes set off for the next adventure, ending Sonic Frontiers, the latest game in the series, so the final game in the timeline as of 2022. With that said, I suppose it's time to wrap things up. In conclusion, what did we learn here? Is Sonic the Hedgehog the greatest story ever told? No, not at all. In fact, half of this video saga was spent filling holes with headcanon when things stopped making sense as early as the very beginning of the franchise. Nobody working on the physics system of Sonic 1 in 1991 had any idea that this would become a series about god monsters and time travel and different dimensions and planets or any of that other stuff. But the franchise slowly evolved into those things as time went on. At the beginning of this video series, I said that while I think of the reason we're wasting oxygen on the topic of Sonic lore, I was going to present it to you. When I wrote that line, it was just supposed to be a joke to get us into the video, knowing the futility of the topic, but here I am at the end and I realize what the reason was. It's not because I'm here to convince anyone that Sonic needs to be preserved alongside the works of Shakespeare, it's because it's the ultimate tribute to the series that I could do. Thinking back on it, why did I like Sonic as a kid? It wasn't even the sense of speed or replayability or any of that. Those are things I enjoy about the games now, but back then it was purely about the characters and the world they inhabited. There was no series quite like it, doing such epic quests with these well-designed and fun characters. Sonic was just a unique blend of different elements, and that mixture was something really special. There still isn't a series like Sonic. The name of the retrospective is Sonic is Distinctive, and that's something I've been saying since 2020. My reasoning as to why has evolved in those last 2.5 years, but right now I see it like this. Sonic is a franchise with a unique talent for inspiring people to talk about it, share their memories with it, and make new ones entirely through fan works. The Sonic fanbase has produced an infamously large amount of toxicity, but also a lot of beauty via art and fan games and such. The franchise has such a unique ability to survive disaster after disaster because of those characters and that world that people got sucked into when they were a kid that keeps them loyal to the brand, even when things might not go in the direction you like. I don't like every game I just spent the last 2.5 hours going over. Some of them I was borderline making fun of while writing about them. But the series is cool. There is nothing quite like it, as I said. So that's why I did this project. I felt like my reviewing Forces and Frontiers wouldn't be a fitting end to this years-long journey of talking about Sonic on my channel. No, I wanted to do something big by paying tribute to the thing that made me love Sonic to begin with. The kind of video series I would have eaten up when I was 8 years old, treating every game as though they were equally valid despite some being blatantly goofy, budget, unfinished, or whatever, or if they were serious genre-defining classics. Since I like the Sonic series, and I thought there would be no better way to end the Sonic era of Jay's reviews than this. I'm not done talking about Sonic forever, since like I said, I'm still a fan, and I'll still cover whatever games they do next. I want to talk about the multimedia Sonic projects that have existed over the decades, and perhaps keep talking about the fan games, especially PO6. I mean, I'm chomping at the bit to play that Silver release, but before I get ahead of myself, I'm just saying that now we're pretty much done covering all the games. I'm pretty content with the work I did over these last 2 years as we keep moving forward with the channel, covering games I'm just as, if not plenty more passionate about than this. If you made it this far into the video, and have been following the Sonic Retrospective for however long you have been, I'll say what I always do. Thank you all for watching, and I will see you next time.